Dr. Walensky, I used to have the utmost respect for the guidance from the CDC. I always considered the CDC to be the gold standard. I don't anymore. And I want to give you 3 examples where I think the conflicting, confusing guidance from your agency has undermined public confidence and contradicts the scientific guidance of many experts. The first has to do with school openings, an issue that we've talked about before. The New York Post reported that a powerful teachers union, the AFT, successfully secured changes verbatim in draft guidance on school reopenings. This came about because of an outside group that did a FOIA request that revealed extensive interactions between the AFT and the CDC. This has been described by Dr. Monica Gandhi, a professor who has written extensively about the coronavirus, as very, very troubling. She's referring to the emails back and forth between the CDC and the AFT. And she says, this is not how science-based guidance should work or be put together. My second example is from a New York Times story that appeared today. It talks about CDC guidelines on mask wearing, and where the CDC announced that less than 10% of COVID-19 transmission was occurring outdoors. The article points out that this is, quote, almost certainly misleading, and goes on to say, there is not a single documented COVID infection anywhere in the world from casual outdoor interactions, such as walking past someone on a street or eating at a nearby table. The third example has to do with new guidance the CDC has issued for summer camps. And here are the reactions of 2 experts. One, a pediatric immunologist at Columbia, referred to the recommendations as, quote, senseless. The editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics called the guidance, quote, unfairly draconian. So here we have unnecessary barriers to reopening schools, exaggerating the risks of outdoor transmission, and unworkable restrictions on summer camps. Why does this matter? It matters because it undermines public confidence in your recommendations, in the recommendations that do make sense, in the recommendations that Americans should be following. I'd like you to respond to why the CDC is not following the standard procedures, why it's having offline secret negotiations with one stakeholder that was revealed only through reporting and a FOIA request, why it is exaggerating outdoor transmission. We know that masks make a big difference indoors. They don't outdoors.
Thank you for that question. Maybe if I could take each of your examples one by one. First, the school guidance. As a matter of practice, the CDC engages with stakeholders, with consumers who take our guidance, who use our guidance before it is finalized so we can understand whether it addresses their needs. For our school guidance, we did that with 50 different stakeholders, over 50 actually. I personally engaged with both parents and teachers and many different stakeholders to address what could be done to improve the draft guidance we had. One of those stakeholders recognized that in our guidance, we had addressed what you do if you have immunocompromised children at risk of severe disease, but we had neglected in our draft to address what happens if you have immunocompromised teachers who are getting chemotherapy, who have immunocompromising diseases. The request was that we add some language for what happens if you have immunocompromised teachers and how they should behave in school. That is what we did. We used CDC-based science to make that addition, but the request was to address what happens if you have immunocompromised teachers, and that was an oversight in our initial draft, and we included a science-based response, or a science-based language in our guidance. With regard to the New York Times piece this morning, there's a meta-analysis from Journal of Infectious Diseases that was published in November, I believe, where the top line result of all studies that were included in the systematic review said less than 10% of cases were transmitted outdoors. It is that meta-analysis that combines science from all different science from many different places. I think over 19 studies were included. The top line result was less than 10%, published in the Journal of Infectious Diseases, one of our top infectious disease journals. That is where that came from. It was a published study that synthesized study from many places. With regard to camp, I have a 16-year-old. Every year he comes home from camp and he writes the number of days until he returns to camp the next year. This year, it got to 0, and I told him he wasn't going. I want our kids back in camp. We now have 38,000 new infections on average per day. Last May 11th, it was 24,000, and we sent a lot of kids home and camps were closed. The camp guidance is intended to get our kids to camp and allow them to stay there. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I would just ask unanimous consent that the full New York Times story dated today be placed in the record because it answers, I realize I'm out of time, it answers Dr. Walensky's response.
So ordered.